The sound that precedes the end of the world isn't a bang, as Hollywood movies like to portray. It's a whistle, a high-pitched, rising hum that seems to tear the very fabric of the air. A sound that starts on the horizon and ends inside your skull, vibrating in your bones before you even understand what's happening. That September afternoon on our small farm outside St. Louis, the sky was a blue so clear it hurt my eye. I was 17, and my biggest worry was whether I could fix the west fence before dinner. My father, John, a man of few words and work hard and happy, used to say that a man is measured by the integrity of his fences. My mother, Mary, was in the kitchen, and the sweet, warm smell of her apple pie wafted across the porch, a promise of comfort at the end of hard days. My younger sister, 6-year-old Sarah, chased the chickens in the backyard, her blonde curls bouncing like molten gold in the afternoons. It was a painting of peace, of a simple, honest life that I believed to be unshakable. The whizzing began low, almost imperceptible, blending with the hum of the cicada. But it didn't stop. It grew louder, became more piercing, hungrier. My father stopped hammering, his head raised, his eyes fixed on that immaculate sky. I saw a line of confusion, of a primordial fear I'd never seen before on his face. It was the last time I saw him alive. The world turned to white light and a sound that wasn't sound at all, but a force. I was thrown backward like a rag doll, the air knocked from my lungs, my head slamming into something hard. When the darkness dissipated, the silence was the most terrifying thing I had ever experienced. A heavy, thick silence, filled only with the ringing in my ears and the distant crackle of flame. The air no longer smelled of apple pie and cut grass. It smelled of sulfur, plaster dust, charred wood, and something else, something metallic and sweet that my brain refused to identify. Where our white two-story house had once stood, with its welcoming porch and my mother's flowers in the window, there was now only a smoking crater and a pile of burning rubble. The colors were gone, replaced by shades of gray, black, and the sickly orange of the fire. The cold, paralyzing fear gave way to blind panic. I screamed their name, Dad, Mom, Sarah. My voice came out hoarse, a pathetic scratch in the deathly stillness. I dragged myself through the rubble, each movement sending waves of pain through my body. And then I saw them, or what was left of them. It wasn't like in the movie, where there are noble bodies and dramatic scenes. It was just carnage. A jumble of broken and stained form, unrecognizable if not for the fragments of their clothes I knew so well. My mother's blue-flowered dress, my father's plaid shirt, and, mere a charred piece of wood, the small pink ribbon Sarah wore in her hair. It was then that reality hit me with the force of a second blow. They were gone. In the blink of an eye, my world, my entire universe, had been incinerated. And amidst the smoke and pain, as the shock began to transform into a silent scream that tore from my throat, I heard footsteps and a voice, a calm, almost casual voice that cut through the crackling of the fire. It was then that I began to run, aimlessly, away from that hell that had once been my home. I ran with the smell of death in my nostrils and the taste of ash in my mouth. But it was the words that voice spoke, clear and cold amidst the destruction, that seared themselves into my soul. A sentence that haunts me every silent night. More than the image of the fire or the silence that followed, is sentence that made me understand that the horror of that day was only the beginning. My name is Samuel Peterson, but everyone, from my mother to the boys I played baseball with on the dusty field behind the church, always called me Sam. Today, I'm an old man whose hands tremble when holding a coffee cup, and whose eyes see the world through the hazy filter of nearly 70 years of memory. But back then, in 1943, I was just a 17-year-old boy, strong as a young bull, with the future stretching out before me like our neighbor's cornfield. A green and gold promise that seemed endless. We lived on a small farm in Havenwood, a farming community west of St. Louis, Missouri. To us, the war was a distant thing, a static noise on the radio my father listened to every night, frying at the news of strangely named battles in places we could barely pinpoint on the map. There was Pearl Harbor, of course, and all the older boys who enlisted. But the real conflict, the dirt and blood, seemed to belong to another world. A different planet separated from us by an ocean of certainty and security. No one, in their wildest nightmare, imagined that the sky over the heart of America would open and spit fire. We were wrong. Tragically wrong. That attack was no isolated act. It was the first thunder of a storm no one saw coming. The beginning of a campaign of terror designed to break the country's back before the real invasion even began. But before I become the bitter old man I'm today, let me tell you about the world they burned. Let me tell you about what was home. The center of my universe was my father, John Peterson. He was a man sculpted by the land he farmed, quiet, resilient, and incredibly strong. His hands were maps of a lifetime of work, callous and with dirt permanently embedded under his nail, but capable of surprising gentleness when repairing Sarah's wooden toy or adjusting my mother's. He wasn't a man of hugs or easy words of affection, but his love was in every fence post he planted, in every harvest he brought home, in the way he looked at us over dinner, the rare, small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He taught me to read the weather by the cloud, to know when the soil was ready for a planting by its smell, and to understand that respect wasn't given, but earned through sweat and honesty. Every morning, before sunrise, we would go out together to milk the cows. The silence was broken only by the rhythmic sound of milk hitting the bucket and the warm breath of the animals in the cool morning air. It was in these moments, in this shared silence, that I felt the deepest connection with him. He was my rock, my North Star, the embodiment of immutability. The idea that he could be broken was as inconceivable as the idea of the sun not rising. If my father was the fabric of our home, my mother, Mary, was the warmth that filled it. She moved around the house with a gentle energy, often humming an old melody. She kneaded bread or mended one of my overalls. The kitchen was her kingdom, a magical place that smelled of cinnamon, yeast, and love. Her apple pie was legendary in the county, but it was her beef stew, which simmered slowly on the stove all day, that truly meant home to me. She kept a small flower garden near the port, full of roses and daisies, and told me it was important to have beauty to look at, even on the hardest day. It was she who read us stories at night, her voice creating worlds of adventure and fantasy that took us far from the routine of the farm. She taught me kindness, compassion, the importance of a kind word. When I hurt my knee, it was her hands that cleaned the wound. When I had a nightmare, it was her calm presence beside my bed that warded off the monster. She was the embodiment of security, a safe haven against any storms life could bring. My most vivid memory of her is seeing her on the porch late one afternoon with a basket of laundry, the scent of sun and soap wafting from the clean clothes as she folded, her gaze lost in the simple beauty of our countryside. And then there was Sarah. My little sister was the light, the pure, unbridled joy of our family. At 6, she saw the world as a place of infinite wonder. Every ladybug was a treasure, every muddy puddle an opportunity for adventure. I was her hero, her protector. I built her a swing set in an ancient oak tree in the backyard, and her crystal clear laughter as I pushed her higher and higher is a sound my brain, in an act of self-defense, sometimes allows me to forget. I remember her tiny fingers gripping mine tightly when we went to the barn. Her endless questions about everything, from why the sky was blue to why chickens couldn't fly like other birds. She had a rag doll named Lily, with buttons for eyes, who accompanied her everywhere. Lily was always covered in dirt or with a small tear that my mother patiently stitched. Sarah was the promise of our future, the innocence that war should not touch. She was the reason men like my father worked themselves to the bone, to ensure that children like her could simply be children, carefree and happy. Losing my parents was like having the ground ripped out from under me. Losing Sarah was like having the sky itself erased. That afternoon, before the whizzing began, she made me promise that after dinner, we would lie on the grass and look for a constellation. It's a promise I could never keep. I don't know how many hours or miles I ran. The animal instinct that gripped me, the pure, blind terror, was a fuel that burned hotter than the pain in my ribs or the blood trickling from a cut on my forehead. I just ran, my lungs on fire, the sound of that calm voice echoing in my head, drowning out the whizzing of the bomb and the sound of my house disintegrate. The race only ended when my legs gave out. and I collapsed in the dust of a dirt road I knew so well. Night had fallen. The air, once warm from the fire, was now freezing, and an uncontrollable tremor gripped my body, a mixture of shock, cold, and the most absolute loneliness a human being can experience. Lying there, staring up at an indifferent, star-filled sky, reality began to seep through the cracks in my panic. My family was no longer beneath that same sky. They were nowhere, and I was alone. The hunger began as a dull pain, a grotesque reminder that my body, against my will, insisted on living. It was a hunger that filled me with shame. How could I feel hungry when the smell of my mother's pie was still in my memory, now forever associated with the smell of death? It was this sense of betrayal of my own grief that finally made me cry. Not loud sobs, but silent, broken cries, the tears clearing paths through the soot that covered my face. I was found by a patrol of local police, farmers and shopkeepers now carrying rifle and wearing makeshift armor. Their faces, illuminated by the headlights of a pickup truck, lacked the compassion my desperate, childish soul craved. They showed fear, distrust. I was an anomaly, a bloodied, ash-covered apparition babbling about an air raid. I was taken to downtown Havenwood, which was unrecognizable. Black huts in every window, sandbag barricades in front of City Hall. The air was thick with a tense silence, the kind that precedes a scream. Instead of being taken to a doctor or a place, I was escorted to the sheriff's office, which had been transformed into a makeshift command post. The smell of stale coffee and sweat hung in the air, and it was there that my first pain, the pain of loss, was overshadowed by a new, piercing sensation. They sat me down on a hard wooden chair, under the light of a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, and left me to wait. No one offered me a blanket. No one asked if I was okay. I was evidence, a problem to be processed. People passed by, looking at me with a mixture of pity and suspicion, and whispering to each other. "It's the Peterson boy," I heard one of them say. "The only one who survived." The way they said "the only one" sounded not like a miracle, but like an accusation. The man who came to interrogate me wasn't from Havenwood. He wore a dark, rumpled suit and introduced himself as Agent Miller, from some government agency whose name I forgot the moment he said it. He didn't look like a soldier, but his eyes were cold and calculating, devoid of any human warmth. He placed a metal cup of water in front of me and a piece of stale bread, which I devoured with a voracity that filled me with even more shame. He waited for me to finish, silent, then began. The questions weren't about my well-being, about my grave. They were cold, technical questions. What direction did the sound come from, Peterson? Did you see any insignia on the aircraft? What was the estimated altitude? I tried to answer, but the words came out jumbled, stumbling in my pain. How could I know the altitude of something that only manifested itself as the end of my world? He wrote everything down in a small notebook, his face impassive. With each response, I felt as if I were cheapening my family's death, reducing the most cataclysmic event of my life to a series of useless facts. The humiliation deepened. I wasn't a grieving son, a broken brother. I was a witness, an unreliable witness. The climax of that silent torture came when he leaned forward, the smell of tobacco on his breath sickening. "It's statistically unlikely you survive, Sam," he said, using my first name for the first time, which somehow made it worse, a false intimacy that was more violent than a scream. "You were outside, away from the main explosion. Why?" The question hung in the air, heavy with a new endo. Why? I didn't know. Guilt, a poisonous, began to sprout in the fertile soil of my shock. Why had I survived? Why was I repairing the west fence and not on the porch with? His question transformed me from victim to suspect in my own eyes. Then he asked about the voice. I tried to explain, about the eerie calm, about the words I'd heard as I read. My description was feverish, rambling. "What phrase, exactly?" he pressed, but I couldn't say it. The words stuck in my throat, coated in a layer of horror. "Shock can create auditory hallucination," he concluded with clinical finality, dismissing the sharpest fragment of my trauma as an unimportant symptom. He closed the notebook. For him, the conversation was over. He stood, told me I would stay in a back room until they decided what to do with me. He didn't offer me a word of comfort. He didn't say, "I'm sorry for your loss." He just left me there, alone in the cold light, my pain invalidated, my survival questioned, and my grief tainted with suspicion. Locked in a cold room with only a rough, musty-smelling blanket, I understood that war didn't just kill with bomb. It also killed with word, with looks, with the bureaucratic coldness that can make a survivor feel more dead than those they lost. Indignation burned more than hunger and cold. They hadn't just lost my family. They were trying to steal my pain, the only thing I had left. They released me from that cold room after today, not with an apology, but with a piece of paper that formalized what my heart already knew. I was Samuel Peterson, orphan, sole survivor of the Peterson farm, now owned by the United States government. I was placed in the care of Martha, a stern-eyed widow who ran a makeshift orphanage in the basement of the Presbyterian church. The place smelled of mildew and disinfectant, and housed a dozen other children whose parents had been killed in the attacks that, as I would soon discover, spread like a cancer through our region. The horror, I realized, had not ended with the fire that consumed my home. That was only the first scream. What followed was a long, endless wail, the slow, methodical disintegration of everything we knew. War was no longer a distant news story on the radio. It was the air we breathed, the dust that covered everything, the constant fear that settled in the pit of our stomach. Havenwood, the quiet little farming town, transformed into a military fortress overnight. The streets where I used to ride my bike were now patrolled by jeeps and soldiers with young, scared faces. The storefront windows were boarded up, and the movie theater where I first kissed a girl became a makeshift morgue. My new life was a cycle of exhaustion and numbness. At 17, I was considered strong enough for hard labor. I was assigned to a reconstruction team, a cruel euphemism for what we actually did, demolishing what couldn't be saved and clearing away the remnants of shattered lives. We spent our days amidst the rubble, the sound of our shovels and pickaxes against the broken concrete a soundtrack to our lost youth. With each house we cleared, I relived my own trauma. The smell of cold smoke and wet plaster permeated my clothes, my hair, my skin. It became my perfume. The sound of air raid sirens became as common as birdsong used to be. At first, each time the piercing wail pierced the air, panic drove us to the ground, sending us scrambling from makeshift shelter, our hearts pounding wildly against. But over time, a frightening indifference set in. My body still reacted with a surge of adrenaline, but my mind shut down, too tired to fully experience the terror. The ground shook frequently, the result of bombing raids on neighboring cities, bridges, and railways. Each tremor was a reminder that the enemy was up there, in the blue sky I once loved, and that at any moment, our number could be drawn again. The war had become a macabre lottery. Hunger was a constant companion. Rations were meager, stale bread, water soup with a few vegetables floating in it, the occasional piece of questionable meat. I dreamed of my mother's stew, the weight of a freshly picked apple in my hand, and woke with my stomach growling and a bitter taste of loss in my mouth. The horror lay not only in the physical destruction, but in the erosion of the human spirit. I saw neighbors who had known each other their entire lives accusing each other of hoarding food. I saw fear transform good men into suspicious and selfish creatures. Propaganda was everywhere, posters depicting a dehumanized enemy, encouraging hatred, telling us that sacrifice was noble. But at street level, in the work of clearing the rubble, there was nothing noble. There was only loss. One day, while clearing the remains of a house a few blocks from the church, my shovel hit something soft. It was a photo album, soggy and covered in mud. The pages were glued together, but I managed to open. The photo showed a family, not unlike my own, smiling at a picnic. A father with a funny mustache, a mother in a sundress, two small children making faces at the camera. They looked happy, secure, immortal. In that moment, I understood that every piece of debris, every broken brick, every shard of glass, was the end of a story like that. They were the remains of laughter, of family dinners, of promises of bedtime. And if no one told these stories, it would be as if those lives had never existed, erased as completely as their home. That's why it's so important to hear these memories, to share them, so that their sacrifice, and that of so many others, isn't lost in the silence that follows the explosion. If you, listening to me now, feel the weight of these words, know that by sharing this story, you prevent the silence from winning. You keep the flame of memory alive against the wind of oblivion. I held that album for a long time, the only monument to an anonymous family, and I felt a cold, deep rage grow within me. A rage against war, against the enemy, against the sky, against silence. The escalation continued relentlessly. What began as sporadic air raids evolved into a constant, palpable threat. Enemy reconnaissance overflights became daily, their planes ominous silver silhouettes against the cloud. They were mapping, planning. The newspapers that arrived, when they arrived, spoke of a battlefront opening on our own soil, hundreds of miles to the east. Invasion, once a terrifying fantasy, now seemed inevitable. We began digging trenches on the outskirts of Havenwood. The same shovels that cleared the remains of houses now digging defenses in the fertile Missouri soil. The work was brutal, from sunrise to sunset. The sound of our labored breath, the thud of the earth being thrown, the grim camaraderie among us, young and old, transformed into labors of death. We were not soldiers, but we were building our own tomb. One night, the attack came closer than ever. The siren screamed, and this time the sound of the planes wasn't a distant drone, but a deafening roar that seemed to rip through the roof of our shelter. We huddled in the darkness of the church basement, a tangle of trembling bodies. We could hear the sharp whistle of falling bombs, and then the earth heaved with a series of violent explosions, seemed to lift the very ground beneath us. Dust rained from the ceiling, children cried, adults prayed in feverish whispers. I didn't pray. I just kept holding my head in my hand, waiting for the direct hit that would render me, like my family, nothing. The bombs didn't hit the city center. They fell in the fields to the west, likely targeting the new anti-aircraft battery that had been installed. But the psychological impact was devastating. When the all-clear sounded and we emerged into the night, smelling of kudite, no one felt relieved. No one felt lucky. We only felt the noose tightening a little round our necks. The attack on my home hadn't been an end. It had been a warning. The real horror, the horror of battle, of hand-to-hand combat, of death not by an anonymous bomb but by the hands of another man, was coming. And we, the survivors of Havenwood, were in the front row, waiting. I thought the human capacity for a pain had a limit. I believed that once your soul was empty, there was nothing left to take. War, however, is a patient and cruel teacher, and its cruelest lesson is that the well of suffering is infinite. After the loss of my family, I closed myself off. I became a ghost inhabiting a young body, performing mechanical tasks, eating without tasting, sleeping without rest. My emotions were locked away in some cold cellar of my mind, and I had no intention of visiting. It was Leo who began to break down the door. Leo was a boy from Kansas City, 2 years younger than, thin as a twig, and with a pair of brown eyes that still held a spark of defiance, something that had already extinguished. His entire family had been lost in the bombing of a train station while trying to escape where he was assigned to the same work crew as me, and at first I ignored him, just as I ignored everyone else. But Leo was as persistent as a weed. He talked, even when I didn't respond. He told bad jokes that ended in an awkward silence, broken only by the sound of our tool. He shared his ration of bread with me, even when I knew he was as hungry as I was. "You're big. You need more fuel to carry that funeral face," he'd say, with a half-smile that didn't reach his eye. Little by little, against my will, he broke through my defense. We began to talk during the long, exhausting hours of work. We talked about the before. He told me about his dream of becoming a professional baseball player, about the smell of the field after the rain. I hesitantly talked about my farm, about Sarah's, about the smell of my mother's pie, talking about them hurt. But with Leo, the pain was different. It was a shared pain, which somehow made it a little lighter. For the first time in months, I didn't feel completely alone in the universe. He was the first and only anchor I'd found in that ocean of horror. He was proof that something like friendship could still exist. The day I lost began like any other. Gray skies, cold air, the taste of thin coffee in our mouth. Our task was to retrieve steel beams from a bombed-out auto parts factory on the outskirts of Heavenwood. The place was a skeleton of twisted metal and broken concrete, dangerous and unstable. The foreman warned us to be careful, but carelessness was part of the routine. Constant fear made us weary, and fatigue made us reckless. We were inside one of the main warehouse, a vast, cavernous space where daylight barely penetrated through holes in the ceiling. The silence was heavy, broken only by the metallic echo of our tools, the creak of metal beneath our feet. Leo stood next to me, trying to free a beam from a tangle of cable. He was whispering how he would build a wooden house with his own hands when the war was over, a place where no one could reach him. I was about to make a joke about his skinny hands not being able to lift a hammer when I heard him. It wasn't a crash, but a groan. A deep, guttural groan that came from the very structure of the building. Metal, tired of fighting gravity, was giving way. I looked up and saw a section of the ceiling, the size of a train car, slowly shifting. It all happened in the blink of an eye and in slow motion at the same time. I screamed his name, Leo, but there was nowhere to run. The world dissolved in a deafening roar of twisting metal and pulverizing concrete. I was thrown sideways by a shockwave of air and dust, and darkness swallowed me. When I woke, silence had returned, but it was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of a tomb. I was trapped, my right leg crushed beneath the concrete. The pain was a hot, pulsing ember, but my first thought wasn't of myself. I called his name, my voice a dry croak in a dust-clogged throat. Leo. A faint moan answered, coming from somewhere nearby in the darkness. Sam, I'm here. Hope, fragile and stupid, blossomed in my chest. He was alive. Are you okay? I asked, trying to move, but the pain pinned me to the spot. I don't think so. His voice was a weak, aching whisper. I can't feel my legs. It's all dark here, and heavy. I began digging at the dirt and rubble round me with my hand, ignoring the pain in my leg, the skin tearing at. I needed to reach him. I couldn't lose him. The darkness was total, but his voice was my guide. We talked to keep ourselves awake, to keep the fear at bay. He made me promise that if I got out of there, I would tell the world about him, that he wasn't just a number, that he was Leo, that he liked baseball and was afraid of the dark. I promised. He started talking about his mother, about the smell of her hair. His voice was getting fainter and fainter, more distant. It's getting cold, Sam, he whispered. I told him to hold on, that help was coming, that we would get out of there, and he would build his log house. I was lying to him and to myself. After a while, there was a long pause. Leo. I called, Leo, talk to me. A final whisper floated through the darkness. Sing to me, Sam. Sing that song. About the sun. I couldn't remember any songs about the sun. My mind was a void of panic and pain. Then I began humming the only melody I could think of. A lullaby my mother had sung to Sarah. I sang it in the darkness, my voice choked with tears, to my only friend as he lay dying. And then he fell silent. The silence that followed was the loudest sound I had ever heard. I was rescued hours later. They pulled me from the rubble, my leg broken, my hand. The first thing I said was about Leo. He's over there. I pointed to the pile of metal and concrete. The foreman looked at the mountain of debris, then back at me, his face expression. There's no time for this, boy. We need the beams. He's gone. We have to keep going. They carried me away, and I looked back at my friend's metal grip. They wouldn't even recover his body. He was just another obstacle, another delay in the war effort. In that moment, something inside me finally broke beyond repair. The bomb that killed my family shattered my outer world. Leo's death, and the callous cruelty that followed, shattered my inner world. The war hadn't just taken my home and my future. It had taught me the most devastating lesson of all. Love, friendship, any kind of human connection was just a weakness, an invitation to more pain. That night, lying on a makeshift hospital bed, I made a new promise to myself. I would feel nothing anymore. I would become as hard and cold as the steel they were forcing us to retrieve. I would survive. But the boy named Sam, the one who loved his family and who had found a friend in the darkness, that boy died in that warehouse, along with Leo. The icy shell I had built round my heart served me well during the months following Leo's death. I worked more, spoke less, and let no one near me. I became efficient, a flesh and blood machine whose sole purpose was to survive the day. I operated under the illusion that if I felt nothing, nothing else could hurt me. But war was approaching, teaching, once again, the depths of my naïve. The invasion began not with a bang, but with silence. For 2 days, the reconnaissance overflight ceased. The distant tremors stopped. The silence was unnatural, heavy, like the air before a violent storm. We all felt it. In the ration line, no one spoke. At the workstation, the tools seemed to loud. Everyone looked to the eastern horizon, to the dark tree line that marked the end of the world we knew, and we waited. The wait was its own form of torture, a slow drain on my nerves that was almost worse than the violence itself. I found myself touching the scar on my leg, the physical reminder of my promise not to feel. I was ready, I told myself. I was made of steel. At dawn on the 3rd day, hell opened its gates upon us. It began with artillery. It wasn't like the sporadic bombardments we'd endured before. This was systematic, apocalyptic. The sound wasn't a series of explosions, but a continuous, deafening roar that made the air vibrate and the ground ripple like water. From my bunk in the church basement, I felt the entire building shake, decades-old dust raining down from the ceiling. There were no sirens this time. There was no need. The whole world was a siren. We were dragged from our beds by screaming sergeants, their faces illuminated by strobe flashes from the explosions outside. The order was simple. All men and boys over 16 were to report to the town square. The battle for Havenwood had begun, and we were the first and last line of defense. In the square, chaos was absolute. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of ozone. What remained of the town hall was in flame. Amidst this pandemonium, they herded us into a line and handed us heavy, Cosmoline greased World War I rifle. A sergeant demonstrated how to load and release the weapon with quick, impatient movement. I held the rifle, the metal cold against my hand. It felt like an alien object. I, who had spent my life building fences and planting seed, now held a tool designed for the sole purpose of ending life. I was shoved into a group led by a lieutenant with wild eyes and a nervous stick, and we ran through the streets I knew like the back of my hand. But they weren't my streets anymore. They were a maze of craters, burning cars, and bodies. We were positioned behind a barricade made of cobblestone and an overturned milk truck, facing the main street leading out of town. And then we waited as the world exploded round us. The bombardment stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. And then we heard them. First, the low, grinding sound of metal, which grew into a deafening thud of tank tracks chewing on us. Then the screams in a language I didn't understand, guttural and filled with a fury that seemed inhuman. Emerging from the smoke like apparition, they came. First, the steel monsters spewing fire, and behind them, waves of infantry, silhouettes running in a crowd, their bayonets gleaming in the sickly dawnlight. The lieutenant shouted the order to open fire. The world dissolved into a pandemonium of sound and fury. My first shot was almost accidental. The rifle's recoil slammed into my shoulder with the force of a fist, the noise exploding near my ear. I didn't aim at anything, just pointed at the enemy and pulled the trigger, again and again. The smell of burning gunpowder filled my nostril, acrid and addictive. Beside me, a farmer I'd known since childhood, Mr. Abernathy, let out a gurgling scream and fell to the side. A red hole where his eye used to be. Panic hit me, a wave of ice that threatened to paralyze me. But then the image of Leo, dying in the darkness, surged into my mind. The promise of hardening me. The icy shell reform. I stopped thinking. I stopped feeling. I became an extension of the rifle. Loading, aiming, firing. Time lost its meaning. Minutes became hours. The sun rose, but the sky remained dark, choked with smoke. Our barricade was crumbling. The men round me were falling, one by one. The lieutenant was dead, his body bent at an impossible angle. The roar of enemy guns grew closer, their screams louder. They were flanking us. We were lost. A mortar blast hit the milk truck, throwing me back against the wall of a store. My head slammed shut, and for a moment, stars danced in my vision. When my head cleared, I was alone. The barricade had been taken. The air was filled with dust and the sound of running boots. I scrambled to the door of the store Mr. Gable's old pharmacy and hid behind an overturned counter. My rifle was somewhere outside. I was unarmed. That's when the door kicked open. An enemy soldier entered, his silhouette framed by the firelight outside. He was young, not much older than me. His face was covered in dirt and sweat, his eyes wide and filled with a mixture of exhaustion and combat fear. He saw me. Our eyes met for a split second. There was no hatred in his gaze, only surprise. Time stood still. In that instant, he wasn't a monster, not a faceless silhouette. He was a boy, just like me, terrified and thousands of miles from home. He raised his rifle, and the icy shell inside me didn't just crack. It shattered into a million pieces. Survival instinct, the most primal and ugly thing in existence, took over. Before he could fire, I lunged forward from below and slammed my head into his stomach. We fell in a tangle of limbs, rolling among shards of glass and broken medicine bottles. He was stronger, but I was more desperate. He tried to point the rifle at me, but I held the barrel with both hands, the point of the bayonet inches from my face. We fought an animalistic silence, only the sound of our labored breaths and grunts. My hand found a large shard of glass on the ground. Without thinking, I grabbed it and slashed upward at his neck. I felt the glass sink into my flesh, a wet, ripping sound. A hot jet of blood sprayed my face. His eyes widened even more, this time in shock and incomprehensible pain. The grip on his rifle loosened. He let out a gurgling sound, the same sound Mr. Abernathy had made, and fell on top of me. For a moment, we lay there, me lying under the weight of the boar I had just killed, feeling the last tremors of life leave his body, his warm blood soaking my shirt. I pushed him aside and stood, shaking uncontrollably. I looked at his face. The life had drained away, leaving only a waxen mask of surprise. I had become one of them. I had killed. And in the silence that followed my act, the phrase I had heard the day my family died echoed in my head, as clear as if it had been whispered in my ear at that very moment. The horror wasn't death. It was this. It was survival. It was then that I heard the cry outside. Retreat. Retreat to the river. The battle for Havenwood was lost. Staggering, I grabbed the dead boy's rifle and left the store, joining a stream of wounded and defeated survivors fleeing the burning city we once called home. I didn't look back. There was nothing left to see. We ran until the smoke of Havenwood was nothing more than a dirty smudge on the horizon, and the sound of battle was a distant, dying thunder. The retreat wasn't a tactical maneuver. It was a stampede of broken soul. We stopped on the banks of a tributary of the Missouri River, a place that in another life would have been perfect for a picnic. The small troop of survivors, a mix of ragged soldiers and civilians like me, transformed into fighters by necessity, collapsed on the dew-soaked ground. No one spoke. The only sound was that of labored breathing, muffled groans of pain, and the gentle, indifferent flow of the river. After the absolute pandemonium of battle, the silence that enveloped us was heavier and more deafening than any explosion. It was a silence that had weight, shape, and texture. It seeped into your ears and filled the empty spaces left by the noise, and in those spaces it planted the echoes of horror. I heard the ghostly drone of bullets, Mr. Abernathy's gurgling scream, the roar of the tank, the last breath of the boy I'd killed. The silence wasn't peace, it was a museum of terrible sound. I wandered away from the group, finding a secluded spot at the water's edge, where the roots of an ancient willow tree dipped into the current. I sat down and looked at my hands. They were covered in dirt, gunpowder, and the dark, dried blood of another human being. They felt like they belonged to someone else. I moved them, closed my fingers, but felt no connection. They were the hands of a stranger, the hands of a killer. The adrenaline that had driven me, that had turned my fear into blind rage, had completely drained away, leaving behind a void so vast and cold it felt like my chest had been hollowed out. I was a shell. The boy who loved his farm was dead. The hardened boy who had survived the loss of his friend was dead. Who or what was this thing that kept breathing? This creature that could plunge a shard of glass into another boy's neck and then walk for a mile. The loneliness I felt in that moment was unlike anything I had ever experienced. After my family died, I was alone. After Leo died, I was alone. But now, surrounded by fellow sufferers, I felt a deeper loneliness, an existential loneliness. I had crossed an invisible border, and now I was in a country unlike any other. They had fought. They had witnessed death. I had become deaf, unable to bear the sight of blood for another second. I knelt on the muddy bank and plunged my hands into the icy river water. I began to scrub them frantically. The water turned pink and brown, and the blood began to dissolve, carried away by the current. I scrubbed until my skin was red and raw, as if I could rip the memory away along with the stain. But it was useless. I could wash away the physical blood, but the blood in my soul, the phantom sensation of the weight of that body, the warmth of its life pouring over me, that was indelible. The river water was clean, pure. It flowed as it always had, oblivious to our war, our pain, our savagery. A bird sang on a branch above me, a joyful, carefree melody. That simple, natural sound was the most obscene thing I had ever heard. How dare the world go on? How dared a bird sing when Havenwood was burning and a boy lay dead on the floor of a pharmacy with my DNA under his fingernail? The disconnect between the indifferent beauty of nature and the ugliness of my recent experience created a nausea within me. I felt like a mistake, a blot on the landscapes that no longer fit into the natural order of. I looked up and observed the other survivors. An old man sat, rocking back and forth, his eyes empty. A young soldier, not much older than, wept silently, his face buried in his hand. A woman tried to comfort a child who stared blankly into space. I saw their pain, their losses, their fears. They were mirrors of my own suffering, but I could feel no connection, no camaraderie. The act of killing had placed me behind glass. I could see them, but I could not touch them. I no longer belonged to them. The battle was over. The race was over. And now, in the silence, the real war began, the war inside my own head. I had survived, but at what cost? Survival didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a sentence to live with what I had done, with what I had become. The emptiness wasn't just the absence of my family or my friend. It was the absence of myself, of the Samuel I knew. And in the silence of that morning, on the banks of an anonymous river, I understood that perhaps the worst part of war is not dying in it, but being forced to live after, carrying the weight of all its ghosts. The time after the fall of Havenwood is a blur in my memory, a succession of grey days and starlessness. We, the survivors, were absorbed into the gigantic, impersonal machinery of war. We were herded into overcrowded refugee camp, interrogated, catalogued, and then assigned to new tasks. The war continued, the front line moved westward, and we were just another piece of human debris left in its wake. I moved through this new world like a sleepwalker. My healed leg ached with dampness. My hand, now calloused in a different way, worked without my mind needing to give them order. I dug latrines and loaded supply trucks, helped erect tents for the new, endless streams of displaced people. I did whatever I was told, in silence. The emptiness that had settled within me by the river hadn't diminished. It had simply become my natural state. I had accepted the darkness. I believed the ultimate lesson of war was the annihilation of meaning. Love, kindness, hope, they were just pretty words for the things people lose. The only truth was strength, the instinct for survival, the shard of glass in the darkness. I carried the memory of the boy I killed like a stone in my stomach, a cold, constant weight that reminded me of the stark truth of what we were capable of. My catharsis, if you can call it that, didn't come in a flash of divine light or a moment of heroism. It came in the most hellish place I'd ever known, a field hospital a few miles from the new front line. The air there was a nauseating mix of antiseptic, blood, and gangrene. The sound was a constant symphony of pain scream, moan, and the feverish whispers of men begging for their mothers' awful morphine. I was assigned to the sanitation, which meant I spent my days carrying buckets of medical waste, mopping the blood-stained floor, worst of all, helping move bodies to the morgue. It was soul-destroying work. a daily immersion in human misery at its rawest. I saw men missing limbs, their faces burned, the hollow eyes of those who had seen too much. I saw the cost of war, without propaganda, without glory. And this only reinforced my conviction that the universe was an indifferent slaughterhouse. I was there, surrounded by definitive proof that nothing mattered. And it was in the midst of that hell that I saw her. She was a Red Cross nurse, a middle-aged woman named Edith. She wasn't tall or imposing, and her face was permanently etched with exhaustion, with dark circles under her eyes. But she moved through the rows of beds with a calm and efficiency that was, in itself, an act of defiance against the chaos round her. I watched her for days, a silent figure amid the cacophony of pain. And then came the moment that changed everything. They brought in a new batch of wounded, and among them were several enemy prisoners. One of them was just a boy, no older than I had been when it all began, with a horrific shrapnel wound in his chest. He was delirious with pain and fear, screaming in his foreign language. Hatred rose in my throat like bile. He was one of them, one of the monsters who burned my home, who forced me to hide in hole, who turned me into a killer. A part of me, the cold-hard part one had cultivated, wanted him to suffer. I wanted him to die. But Edith approached him. She showed no hesitation, no revulsion, no hatred. She touched his forehead with her hand, murmured soothing words in English, which he obviously didn't understand, but the tone was universal. And then, with the same care and gentleness she bestowed upon our own soldiers, she began to clean his wound, to manage the pain, to save his life. I stood transfixed, watching the scene, an act of compassion so pure and so radical that it seemed to defy all the laws of the new world I lived in. Why would she do this? Why waste precious resources, her limited energy, on someone who, just the day before, was trying to kill her? At that moment, my mother's face appeared in my mind with painful clarity, the way she cared for a bird with a broken wing she found in the garden. Then I thought of my father, of his quiet integrity, of his belief that a man was measured by his action, not his word. I thought of Leo, who shared his bread with me even when he was starving, an act of generosity in the midst of deprivation. And I realized that what Edith was doing was not an act of betrayal or weakness. It was an act of unimaginable strength. It was the affirmation that even when the whole world gives you permission to hate, even when revenge seems the only logical one, choosing humanity is the most powerful act of rebellion there is. The real war, I understood, was not between our flag. It was a war waged within every human heart. The war between compassion and hatred, between memory and oblivion, between construction and destruction. By killing that soldier, I had fought on the terms of the war. Edith, by saving one, was fighting against the war itself. It was as if a dam had broken inside me. All the pain, grief, anger, and guilt I had suppressed came flowing back. I hid behind the morgue tent and cried for the first time since Leo's death. I cried for my family, for Leo, for the boy I had killed, and finally, I cried for the boy I was and would never be again. And amidst that deluge of grief, the phrase that had haunted me for so long returned, the calm voice amid the fire, saying, "This is not the..." For years, I had interpreted it as a threat, a harbinger of more horror. But there, behind that tent, I understood it in a completely new way. It wasn't a threat. It was a truth. The destruction of my home wasn't the end. The death of my family wasn't the end of their influence. The battle, the loss, the horror. None of it was the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new and terrible responsibility. The responsibility to survive not just with my body, but with my soul, and the responsibility to carry the memory of those I lost not as a weight that weighs me down, but as a light that guides me. My father taught me strength. My mother taught me kindness. Sarah and Leo reminded me of innocence and friendship. Killing that boy taught me the price of losing all of that. The lesson I carry from that war isn't about tactics or nation. It's that humanity isn't our default state. It's a choice, and it's a choice we have to make again and again, especially when it's the harder. Surviving, I finally understood, wasn't just about breathing. It was about choosing each day which part of you would nurture, the darkness or the light Edith showed me. And I chose to carry their light. The war, like all storm, eventually petered out. It didn't end with a parade or a peace treaty that filled us with relief. It simply stopped, leaving behind an exhausted silence and a country that needed to learn to look at itself again, at the scars that would never fade. I didn't become a hero. I accomplished no extraordinary feat. I remained what the war made me, a survivor. When I was finally released, I was a young man in my early 20s with the eyes of an old man. I didn't return to Heavenwood. There was nothing there for me but ghosts. I moved west to Oregon, as far as I could go, as if geographical distance could somehow mitigate the closeness of memory. I became a carpenter, a conscious choice. After spending my youth amid demolition, I desperately needed to use my hands to build. Every beam I laid, every nail I hammered, was a small act of rebellion against the chaos, a silent vote for the future. I married a good woman, had children, then grandchildren. I built a life, a good life, full of the small, precious moments of peace that my original family never had the chance to fully enjoy. But I never left the war. No one who is there truly leaves it. It lives within me. It lives in my startle at the sound of a car exhaust, in the smell of wood burning in a fireplace that for a moment transports me back to the smoke of my home. It lives in the way I hold my granddaughter's hand a little tighter than necessary, an echo of the fear of loss that never left me. For many years, I tried to bury the memory. I tried to be just Sam the carpenter. But ghosts are patient. They don't need to scream. They know how to wait. The face of the boy I killed visited me in dream. Sarah's laughter echoed in empty rooms. The whistle of the bomb still cut through the silence of some nights. It was only in old age that I understood that fighting them was futile. The lesson Nurse Edith taught me was not about forgetting, but about carrying. So I stopped fighting and started listening. I hear what they have to say. My father reminds me of resilience. My mother, of kindness. Sarah, of the joy that must be protected at all costs. Leo reminds me of the power of human connection, however brief. And the enemy boy. He is my darkest and most necessary reminder, the reminder of my own fragility, of the fine line that separates a man from a monster. He keeps me honest. I am not a bitter man. Bitterness is a poison you drink, hoping the other person will die. And I've seen enough death to last a lifetime. Instead, I chose to be a guardian of story, of faces, of moment. War erases names and faces, turns people into numbers. My final act of defiance is to remember. I remember the taste of apple pie, the touch of my father's calloused hand, the pink ribbon in Sarah's hair. I remember Leo's bad joke. I remember the compassion in the eyes of an exhausted nurse. These memories are my true home, the only structure no bomb can destroy. Sometime, on quiet nights like this, I look out my window and think of that voice I heard amid the fire, so many years ago. That phrase that tormented me, that guided me, and ultimately, that defined me. This is not the end. He was right, whoever he was. That terrible day was not the end. It was the beginning of a lifetime spent learning to breathe with lungs full of air, to build a house on a plot of land made of memory. A lifetime spent trying to understand how to begin again when your world has already ended one. This is my story, my burden. There are thousands of others like, many of them lost in the silence of time. If the story touched you, if you felt its weight on your heart, help ensure that none of them are forgotten.